Professor Tov, first of all, let me express the gratitude for your participation in your contribution to the International Biblical Conference, and ask you a few additional questions. What is the importance of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and actually what are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
A scroll is something that you roll. So that's one sheet of papyrus or leather sewn into another one. And scrolls are used until today in the liturgical service of the Jews every Saturday and every holiday. Now it so happens that in 1947 the first scrolls, ancient scrolls, were found near the Dead Sea in a place called Qumran, not in excavations, but they were found coincidentally in a cave that later on we came to call cave number 1. And so we now have remnants of some 930 scrolls that were once complete and that were written about 2,000 years ago. That's the time of Jesus. Some as early as 250 before Jesus, or as we say, before the Common Era, and until the year 70 of the Common Era, when the place Qumran was destroyed by the Romans. Now this is an enormous diversity of different scrolls. The most well-known are scrolls of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, which was not known until then from ancient documents. And other scrolls give evidence of an ancient community that lived near the Dead Sea in a place called Qumran. And that is a group, or as we now say, a sect of the Essenes. Now the Essenes were a Jewish group, just like the Pharisees, that are much more known from the New Testament, and Flavius Josephus and Philo. Less known also than the Sadducees, also known from ancient sources. So this group, the so-called Essenes, lived there in community buildings. They had a communal life, like a kibbutz in Israel or a kolkhoz at the time in Russia. And they wrote scrolls, and they brought scrolls to them to the desert, because it's a desert area. And when the Romans came, were about to come, and they were afraid that everything they had collected over the course of some 200 years would be destroyed, they put them in caves. And these caves, after 2,000 years, were coincidentally discovered. That's a long story how they were discovered, but it was coincidentally first a goat entered to a cave, and then the shepherd entered, and that's how the first scrolls were discovered, and later on some more than 900 scrolls.
Right. Could you please tell a little bit more about the community itself, how they lived and their lifestyle, and why they were writing all these scrolls?
This community, the so-called Essenes, and we don't know exactly what the word Essenes means. I think it means healers, according to the Aramaic word asa or asuta, health. This community, in very turbulent times, about 120 before the Common Era, decided to live civilized life in Jerusalem. And they wanted to devote themselves to the spiritual life, just like monks, and they're often called monks. they're called monks by Christians and by scholars, but they were not really monks. They were like monks. And they decided to live in the desert, to earn their living by some agriculture and by some goats they had, and by living a very frugal life. And they devoted themselves only to one thing, to God. They had very strict rules how people could be accepted to the community. It's really very much like a kibbutz. After you have been there 1 year, you were put into test and whether you were good enough to stay there. And for example, if you were a newcomer, you could not just talk to anyone who had been there for some time. You had to wait until the other person turned to you. And they had their weekly assemblies, and 1/3 of the day they studied Hebrew Bible. Or probably more precisely, they studied the 5 books of Moses. And they applied the wisdom of the 5 books of Moses, of the Pentateuch, to their own life. And they were so very religious persons. They considered themselves more strict, and in a way they were more strict than the Pharisees in Jerusalem. And they prayed a lot. So all they did is they prayed and they studied, and some of them, scribes, wrote scrolls. They wrote scrolls of the Bible. They wrote scrolls, compositions that describe their communal life and their rules. So these scrolls are called rules, or srachim in Hebrew. So there's one famous composition called Serech Hayachad, which means the rule of the community. They called their community Yahad, which means together or togetherness. And so we know much about this community. And before the scrolls were found, we already knew about them from Flavius Josephus and from Philo. And the descriptions do not exactly match what we find in the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're more or less the same. Some of their principles were, for example, very clean body. So it's desert, it's hot, so they immersed in water several times a day. The immersion was important to them as it was later on for Christianity, except that for Christianity the immersion had a spiritual meaning, of course, the baptism. But they have this in common with early Christianity. Their leader was a man called Moreh HaTzedek, the teacher of righteousness. And this may have been one person or several persons. That is, one teacher of righteousness, and when he died came another one, we don't know. And it was a wonderful community, a very spiritual community. It was also difficult to be there, because the leader, and they had a social commander, so to speak, who said, if you don't do this, well, then you go into kind of jail, or you were expelled from the community. So it was not an easy life.
How did the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls change the biblical scholarship, particularly in terms of an access to an earlier text than we had before?
The biblical text was known before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, but the biblical text was known actually not from ancient Hebrew sources. We had to rely until 1947 on medieval manuscripts. That is, texts written in the year 2025 and 1100, etc. Those were very good texts. This is a text that is used until today. we call this text the Masoretic text. The Masorah, that is an apparatus of notes that were written on the sides of the biblical text and tells you how many times this word occurs in the Bible, etc. We also had beforehand the Greek translation, the Septuagint. We had the Samaritan text. We had the Vulgate. These are all ancient texts that we knew in early manuscripts, but this is all in translation, except for the Samaritan Pentateuch. But that was also medieval. So, how did we know the Bible beforehand? From late sources. Good sources, but late. So for the first time, we were able to have an insight into scrolls that were 1,000 years older than the medieval text. So from today, we could say 2,000 years old. And for the first time, we saw what the biblical text looked like at the time of Jesus, around the turn of the century, to be precise, from the year 250 onwards. And this is an enormous discovery, because for one thing, we saw that the biblical text from the Middle Ages already existed then. That was a novelty. It was assumed, but we didn't know. It existed then, but without vocalizations. The Hebrew has vowels. So if you take the English word book, B-O-O-K, that would have been, if that were to be Hebrew, that would have been written B-K, and O is a vowel. So in the ancient scrolls, book is just written B-K. So these scrolls were found, but there was an enormous additional discovery. Namely, we found Hebrew scrolls that are different from the Masoretic text. So this has changed our insights. At the time of Qumran, in Qumran itself, but actually in ancient Israel as a whole, there was not one biblical text, but there were many biblical texts. The differences were sometimes very small. In spelling. For example, if you take the English word night, N-I-G-H-T, in America that's written often night, N-I-T-E, that's called spelling. And so there were many small differences in spelling. There were some differences, or actually quite some differences in small details. And there are also quite some differences in large details. For example, in the book of Samuel, in the book of Jeremiah, which is in one of the Qumran texts much shorter than the Jeremiah we know. What does this mean? Well, scholars are still debating what it means. One thing is clear for scholars, that there were different texts. The biblical message is still the same. It still is the Bible. It still is the Holy Bible. It still is the Jewish Bible. It still is the Christian Hebrew Bible. That's all still the same. But we now know there's some internal differences. All these texts were authoritative. That's to say, no one doubted that these were not the Word of God. This was all the Word of God, whether you write it this way or that way. That's a new concept, because we don't live by that concept today. Today we have a strict one text, but at the time it was different. The whole idea of what is the Bible, what is included in the Bible, must have been different then. Everything that's included in the Bible is called the canon. C-A-N-O-N in English. Was the canon at the time different? Scholars still debate. The ancient Greek translation had a different canon. The ancient Greek translation, for example, had the book of Baruch. The ancient Greek translation had the Epistle of Jeremiah and a few other books. These other books are called Apocrypha. So that canon was different. Now the question is, did also the Qumran people have a different canon? That is still debated. I think yes. I think for them the book of Ben Sirah was canonical, that means authoritative. I think for them the book of Jubilees, which is now not at all in the canon, was part of their holy writings. So within Judaism at the time we had a plurality of texts and a plurality of holy script. We today follow the views of what were once the Pharisees. First in Judaism, then in Christianity, but in Christianity it's much more complicated because Christianity first accepted the Septuagint and then the Vulgate, and now it's again somewhat different. So we all want to learn about this, and this is an interesting topic for scholars.
Professor Tov, you mentioned that apart from the biblical scrolls, there are numerous non-biblical scrolls at Qumran. So what do we know on the basis of the non-biblical scrolls about the spirituality, the way the community prayed, and about the literature they read at that time of Jesus?
Many compositions, we call that compositions, were found in Qumran other than the Hebrew Bible. The 930 or so fragmentary scrolls that were found at Qumran were mostly non-biblical. The biblical scrolls are the best known. The biblical scrolls were some 210, 220. All the remainder was non-biblical. Among them are the writings of the Qumran sect, the Essenes, we call those sectarian writings. Among them are biblical commentaries, many songs for God, psalms, many treatises that prescribe how one has to behave. So you might say law codes, just like in later times the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, the Jewish law. We have a different view about many things now, about which we didn't know beforehand. This was the literature of Palestine, the Jewish literature more or less at the time of Jesus. We know more, but we realize that what we know is all seen from a certain angle because the Essenes is not a Pharisee. So we have the books that the Essenes had in their hands in this place called Qumran. The Essenes did not like the Pharisees very much. They write against them. Very similar to the way in which the New Testament Gospels write about the Pharisees. They didn't like them either. So there are parallels in the way the Pharisees were conceived of between the Qumran sect and early Christianity. There are parallels in ideas between the Essenes and the young Christian belief. This is a topic of wide research. Some scholars say there was a direct link between Christianity and Qumran. Some say John the Baptist was present in Qumran. Most scholars don't accept that idea, but Qumran being popular, there's many theories about it. So in every area of literature we now know more. We know more about early prayers. We know more about early psalms, etc. Non-biblical psalms. This is enormously interesting and important in order to know ancient Judaism and also for the background of Christianity.
And what's your personal involvement in the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship?
I've been much involved in the past, what shall we say, 10, 20, 25 years. And before that also. I'm a biblical scholar. I study the books of the Bible, and my specialty is the text of the Bible. And I was asked in the 80s to publish one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Greek text, the Minor Prophets scroll from Nachal Gever. And slowly I got more and more involved, until in 1990 I was asked to head the international team that published the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had a series called DJD, Discoveries in the Judean Desert. Now some 40 such big volumes of text with publication and translation and commentaries and plates. And so I became the head, and it didn't go well until, publication was very slow until I started. And so I had to reorganize the team. I needed money, so I dealt with fundraising for our work. I started to work on computers. And slowly but surely, as things went in the right way, and basically most of the scrolls were published by my team and under my leadership. And so we did some 30 volumes, and in around the year 2009 we finished our work, and everyone is happy. So first I was and am a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then I became involved administratively in the effort to publish them. And so that's a major involvement, and ever since my life has not been the same.
Right. And what do you think is the future of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship?
This goes on, the scholarship, because publication is only one aspect. We change our mind all the time. That is, if there are two little fragments that we think that are together one scroll, or they belong to one scroll. People do research on the content, on the letter, etc., and now all of a sudden they say, no, they're not together. So we have something new to write. So the scroll fragments are constantly evaluated. But the most important thing, I think, is to find the links between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the outside world. That is the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the biblical canon. The Dead Sea Scrolls and early prayer, which is Jewish prayer, but it is also, these are the roots also of Christian prayer. The Dead Sea Scrolls and early Jewish laws, like the Talmud, historical insights. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, that's a topic, major topic for research. That is ideas and here and there a word or a phrase. So the future is to integrate the new knowledge from the Dead Sea Scrolls in all areas of research. And this is an ongoing business. There's 2 journals that are devoted to the Dead Sea Scrolls. One is called Dead Sea Discoveries, in English mostly, the other one in French, Revue de Qumran. There's much more to do, and of course we understand passages in the Hebrew Bible in a better way if we look in certain scrolls.
Professor Tov, I would like, on behalf of the Faculty of Philosophy and Theology of the Ukrainian Catholic University, thank you immensely for your contribution and for your participation in the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to be interviewed, and definitely my pleasure to come here to Ukraine and to participate in this wonderful conference, so enthusiastically organized, and to learn about other views and to see about the enthusiastic involvement of your students who have a great wish to learn more. This I can see, and they will.
Thank you.